"Excuse me, you can't park here. This is private property." Those were the exact words that hit me like a slap to the face the moment I stepped out of my pickup truck. Right in front of the lake cabin I built with my own 2 hands. At first, I thought maybe it was a joke, some kind of prank. But no, the woman marching toward me was dead serious. She had short, stiff, blonde hair, big sunglasses covering half her face, a clipboard in one hand, and a tiny yappy dog in the other. She stood there like she was the sheriff of the whole neighborhood. Her tone was sharp, commanding, and full of that classic HOA attitude. I didn't even get a full breath of lake air before she pointed to a small, faded sign that read H property. No unauthorized vehicles. Her dog barked twice as if it was trying to back her up. "You can't just come here and park wherever you want. This is a restricted area for residents only," she snapped, scanning me like she was trying to find a flaw in my jeans, boots, or maybe the way I carried my fishing gear. I looked her straight in the eyes and calmly said, "Ma'am, I think there's been a misunderstanding." But she wasn't hearing any of it. "I don't care what you think. Rules are rules, and I don't recognize you. This community has regulations for a reason, and I'm not going to stand by while people like you think they can just waltz in here and do whatever they want. Either move your truck or I'm calling the police." I was stunned. Not angry yet, but stunned. Because what she didn't know, what she didn't even think to ask, was that I wasn't just some random guy driving into a neighborhood for fun. That little cabin by the lake, it was mine, built by me, from the ground up, and the rest of this so-called restricted area. I developed the entire thing. Every cabin she saw, every paved road she walked on, every trail and sign and lamppost were all part of the master plan I had created years ago. When this land was just a wild stretch of forest passed down to me by my grandfather. I owned this place before the HOA even existed. And now, here she was, treating me like a trespasser. But instead of shouting or arguing, I simply leaned against the truck and let her rant. Sometimes, letting people reveal their ignorance is the best strategy. I knew that within minutes, her whole world was going to turn upside down, and a small part of me, I'll admit, wanted to see it. She whipped out her phone with a dramatic sigh and started tapping rapidly. "Yes, I'm calling. 911, there's a man parked in front of one of the cabins. He refuses to leave. I don't feel safe." Her voice rose a few octaves for effect. She made sure I could hear every word. She wanted to scare me. She wanted control. Her little dog barked again, as if it knew something big was coming. I stood, silently, watching the lake shimmer in the distance. The peaceful sound of the breeze rustling through the trees was the only thing keeping me calm. 10 years ago, I stood in this very spot, hammer in one hand, blueprint in the other, with nothing but a dream to build a quiet, natural retreat for families to enjoy. And now, somehow, I was being treated like an outsider by a woman who hadn't even been here long enough to know the history of the place. She was pacing now, walking back and forth in front of her luxury golf cart that had HOA stickers all over it, muttering about how people are getting too bold and this is why we need stronger enforcement. A few neighbors peeked out of their cabin windows, curious about the noise. Some watched silently, unsure whether to get involved. One or two waved awkwardly, recognizing me but unsure if they should say anything. I didn't blame them. The HOA in this place had gotten more aggressive over the years. At first, I thought handing over day-to-day operations to a board would help with maintenance and peacekeeping. But somewhere along the line, it became about power, about rules over people, about fear instead of community. And standing there, watching this woman call the police on me in front of my own property, I realized how far things had drifted from the original vision I had. 5 minutes passed. Then 10. Eventually, a sheriff's cruiser pulled up. Bloop, lights off, just a routine response. A young deputy stepped out, adjusted his belt, and walked over calmly. Karen, because let's just call her that, now immediately rushed up to him, pointing at me like I was some kind of threat. "Officer, that's him, that's the man. He parked illegally. He refused to leave when I told him, and he's making everyone uncomfortable." The deputy nodded patiently and turned to me. "Sir, do you mind telling me what's going on here?" I smiled for the first time all morning. "Sure thing, officer. Name's Daniel Matthews. That cabin right there, that's mine. And actually, I built this entire neighborhood." I reached into the glove box of my truck and pulled out a folder. Inside were copies of land titles, blueprints, old photographs, me standing in front of a bulldozer, me shaking hands with the county inspector, even the original layout design with my signature in the corner. The deputy looked through it, raised his eyebrows, and nodded. "Seems like everything checks out. You're the developer." "Yes, sir. An original landowner, before there was an HOA, before there was even a paved road. This was my family's land." Karen stood frozen. The color drained from her face. She opened her mouth, closed it, and took a step back. "That can't be right. The HOA has all the ownership records. There must be some mistake." But the deputy was already shaking his head. Ma'am, he's not trespassing. He's the reason this place exists. She didn't say another word, just turned around, scooped up her dog, and stormed off without looking back. And me, I just stood there with a satisfied grin, finally breathing in the lake air that had been stolen from me by arrogance and ignorance. She had no idea who she was dealing with. Asterisk. To understand how it got to this point, you have to go back way back before there was even a road. Before there were fences and regulations, before anyone had even heard of an HOA in this part of the lake. You see, this land wasn't always covered with neatly built cabins and asphalt driveways. It used to be wilderness, peaceful, raw, a stretch of lakefront forest that had been in my family for nearly 70 years. My grandfather bought it after serving in the war. Said he wanted a place where the only sound he'd ever hear again was the wind through the trees and the water lapping on the shore. He built a tiny one-room cabin with his own 2 hands. No electricity, no running water, just peace. It became his sanctuary, and eventually, it became a part of who we were. Asterisk. When I was a kid, we used to spend our summers out here, fishing early in the morning, swimming in the lake, chopping wood in the evenings. There were no neighbors, just nature. My grandfather passed it on to my father, and my father eventually passed it on to me. By the time I inherited it, I was in my late 30s, burned out from years working construction jobs in the city, tired of the noise, the crowds, the grind. The land called to me in a way nothing else ever had. At first, I thought about just keeping it the way it was, a quiet retreat for weekends and holidays. But then something shifted. I started seeing other families come out to the area, looking for that same escape I had always found out here. The problem was, most of the lake access properties were private, or had been scooped up by developers building luxury homes that didn't care about the nature around them. They cleared entire sections of forest just to put up mansions that didn't fit the spirit of the place. Asterisk. That's when I had the idea. Why not build a community but one that respected the land? One that blended into it, instead of ripping it apart. I wanted cabins, not castles, trails, not pavement, families, not investors. It took everything I had, financially and emotionally, to get the permits, line up the surveyors, and design the layout. I lived in the original cabin during the entire process, waking up every morning with the blueprints laid out on the table and the smell of pine all around me. I wasn't just building houses. I was building something meaningful. I hired a small team of local contractors who understood what I wanted: quality over quantity. We cleared paths carefully, keeping as many old trees intact as possible. We used natural materials for the cabin: stone, timber, reclaimed wood. We built a small dock by the lake, a communal fire pit for gatherings, and even a little walking trail that circled the neighborhood. In total, I designed and oversaw the building of 24 cabins. Each one unique. Each one placed to maximize lake views without disturbing the environment. It wasn't a flashy development. That wasn't the point. It was meant to feel natural, like it had always been there. Asterisk. Once construction was finished, I kept the original cabin for myself, right at the water's edge, tucked away behind the trees where the sunrise hits the dock just perfectly in the morning. The other cabins sold out faster than I expected. Word spread quickly about the hidden community by the lake, and people came from all over the state to check it out. Within a year, every unit was occupied. At first, everything ran smoothly. The residents respected the land. They took care of their cabins. We had barbecues, bonfires, and community cleanup days. It felt like a dream. Asterisk. But with growth comes complication. As more people moved in, concerns started popping up. Who would handle maintenance? What about shared areas? What about rules? That's when a few of the more vocal residents proposed forming a homeowners association. At the time, it didn't sound like a bad idea. They assured me it would be a simple setup, just something to make sure the trash got picked up and the snow got cleared in the winter. I agreed, thinking it would give me some breathing room. I didn't want to manage everything forever. I had done my part. I had built the dream. Now I just wanted to live in it. Asterisk. But within 2 years, the HOA transformed from a maintenance committee into something else entirely, a machine, the kind that starts with good intentions but slowly becomes obsessed with rules, fines, control. The original president stepped down, and a new group came in, more organized, more ambitious. They rewrote the bylaws. They added restrictions. Suddenly, everything needed approval. Want to repaint your cabin? Submit a request. Want to park a trailer for the weekend? Not without a special permit. And the worst part, they started acting like they owned the place. They stopped seeing me as the founder, the builder, the man who brought this neighborhood to life. Instead, I became just another name on their list, just another cabin owner. Asterisk. I tried to ignore it. I kept my distance. I didn't attend the meetings. I figured, as long as they didn't bother me, they could run the neighborhood however they wanted. But that was a mistake, because power unchecked always finds new ground to invade. And little by little, they began treating the land like it was their personal kingdom. They hired a security patrol, some kid in a golf cart with a notepad. They put up surveillance signs. They started issuing warning letters, and then came the ridiculous parking regulations. They decided to designate approved parking areas even though the cabins all had space. It was about control, not logic. Still, I said nothing. Asterisk until that day when I drove up to my own cabin, parked where I'd always parked, and got treated like an intruder. That day was the last straw. Not because I was insulted. I've been called worse. But because it wasn't just about me anymore. It was about the principle. It was about watching something you built, something you poured your soul into, get hijacked by people who forgot where it all began. That woman had no idea that the dirt under her feet, the trees outside her window, the very sign she pointed at like it was loaning of it would exist if it weren't for me. And yet she stood there, barking orders, threatening police action, full of confidence built on nothing but ignorance. That's when I decided I wouldn't let it slide anymore. It was time to remind them. It didn't take long. Less than 15 minutes after the call, the sheriff's cruiser pulled into the gravel road leading toward the lake. The flashing lights were off, but the message was clear: someone had reported a problem. And that problem, apparently, was me. I watched the car roll in calm as ever, because I knew this was going to be one of those moments you don't forget. Not because of the drama, but because of what it would reveal about people, about control, and about how some folks build castles on sand and don't realize it until the tide comes in. The deputy who stepped out was younger than I expected, maybe late 20s, early 30s. Clean uniform, steady eyes. He looked around, taking in the peaceful scenery, then glanced over at the woman who had called him Karen, standing tall like she'd just accomplished something noble. She had a smug look on her face, and her little dog, still yapping from her arm, was practically shaking with the same self-righteous energy. She marched straight to him like a soldier reporting for duty. "Officer, that's him," she said, jabbing her finger in my direction. He parked illegally in front of that cabin and refused to leave when I informed him of HOA regulations. He's been standing there intimidating me, and I believe he's a threat to our community. She sounded so official, so confident. You'd think she had a badge herself. The deputy nodded, scribbled something on a notepad, and walked toward me. "Good afternoon, sir. Do you mind telling me what you're doing here today?" he asked, voice calm, neutral, like he'd already dealt with a dozen Karens this month and wasn't looking for a fight. I nodded, opened my truck door slowly, and pulled out my wallet. "Sure, name's Daniel Matthews. I own that cabin," I said, pointing to the one nearest the lake, the one built with the widest porch and the oldest stone chimney. "Actually, I built it, and the others, all of them." He paused. "You're the developer." "That's right. I developed this neighborhood, Whispering Pines. I started construction about 10 years ago. I was the original landowner. My grandfather passed it down to me. I've got documentation right here, if you need it." He looked curious but cautious, as he should. So I pulled out the folder I kept in my glove box, copies of the original land deed, construction permits, development plans, and a few photos from back in the early days. Me, standing with a hard hat and steel-toe boots, next to the first frame of the very cabin I was being accused of trespassing on. The deputy took his time flipping through them. Meanwhile, Karen's arms were crossed so tightly I thought she might break something. Her face went from smug to confused to slightly nervous. She was already regretting the call, but her pride wouldn't let her back down yet. "Ma'am," the deputy said after a moment, "Mr. Matthews here is indeed the owner of this property. He's also the original developer of this community. He's not violating any law by being here or parking his vehicle." She blinked. But the HOA, he doesn't have a pass. And that spot is designated for residents only." The deputy turned to her and replied, "According to the paperwork I'm looking at, not only is he a resident, he's the reason any of this even exists. And as far as I can tell, he's done nothing wrong." She looked like someone had pulled the rug out from under her feet. Her mouth opened like she was going to say something, but she couldn't find the words. She glanced at me, as if seeing me for the first time, not as some outsider she could boss around, but as someone she should have recognized from day one. And I could see it, the silent realization setting in, the slow burn of embarrassment, climbing up her cheeks, but still she tried to salvage it. "I didn't know," she mumbled. "No one told me." I shrugged. "You never asked." The deputy handed my documents back and nodded respectfully. "You're all good, sir. Sorry to bother you." "No problem," I said. "I know you're just doing your job." As he walked back to his cruiser, Karen stood frozen, trying to hold on to whatever dignity she had left. I didn't gloat. I didn't smirk. I just walked slowly toward my cabin, cooler in one hand, fishing pole in the other, as I'd done 100 times before. But this time, something felt different. Not just because of the scene that had unfolded, but because it confirmed what I'd been feeling for months. The community I built was slipping into the hands of people who didn't care how it started. People who enforced rules without understanding their roots. People who wore power like a badge, instead of holding community like a value. That night, as the sun set over the lake, I sat on my porch with a cold drink in hand, staring at the ripples on the water. The reflection of the trees danced on the surface, peaceful as ever. But inside, I wasn't peaceful. I was reflecting, too. I thought about all the weekends I spent clearing brush with my dad. All the nights I stayed up late drawing designs under lantern light. All the early mornings I drove nails through timber just to keep the dream alive. And now, that dream was being policed by people who had never even asked who built the dock they fish from or who poured the foundation beneath their homes. That was the real offense, not a parking spot, not a vehicle, but the loss of gratitude, the absence of awareness, and the failure to remember that someone had to dream first so others could live comfortably later. The next morning, I walked past the HOA notice board near the main trailhead. I looked at the laminated rules, the long list of regulations printed, in bold, the contact info for security, the hotline for complaints, all written in black and white, all so cold, so disconnected from the warmth this place used to have. And I knew this wasn't just about Karen, this wasn't just about a misunderstanding. It was about a culture that had grown inside something I once loved. It was about pride losing to policy. And if I didn't step up soon, that culture was going to ruin everything. I had stayed silent too long. It was time to speak. The next day, I didn't waste any time. I cleaned up, put on a proper button-down shirt, and walked straight into the Whispering Pines Community Center where the monthly HOA meeting was being held. I hadn't been to one in nearly 2 years, not because I didn't care, but because I had chosen peace. I thought staying out of the politics and letting people handle things their way was the mature route, but clearly, silence had only made room for arrogance. When I stepped into the room, it was like a scene out of a movie. Everyone was already seated, flipping through printed agendas, sipping their coffee, murmuring quietly about landscaping, budgets and mailbox guidelines. Karen was there too, sitting near the front with her usual glare and that same clipboard clutched in her lap like a weapon. Her eyes widened when she saw me, but she quickly looked away, whispering to the woman beside her. I didn't care. I was there for something bigger than my pride. I stood by the sidewall for a few minutes, letting them work through their little points. Something about repainting speed bump lines and whether to allow plastic flower pots on porches. All the while, I looked around and saw faces I recognized. People I had helped personally during construction, folks I had laughed with, eaten meals with, even helped carry furniture into their cabins when they first moved in. But now, the atmosphere had changed. There was this invisible wall between the board and the people, between regulation and real life. Finally, I raised my hand. The board president, a man named Greg who had moved in about 4 years ago and who now treated every meeting like he was running a Fortune 500 company, gave a hesitant nod. Yes, Mr. Matthews, I believe that's right, I said calmly. I'd like a few minutes to speak, if you don't mind. A couple of people in the room shifted in their seats. Some looked surprised. Some looked interested. Greg adjusted his glasses and said, "Go ahead, but please keep it brief. We have quite a few agenda items." I stepped forward, took a deep breath, and began. I wasn't planning to speak today. Truth is, I haven't been to a meeting in a long while, because I thought it would be better to stay in the background. Let others manage the place. Take care of the little things. After all, I've already done my part. I built this neighborhood. From the ground up, I designed the roads you drive on, cleared the land under your cabins, and laid the first stone at the community fire pit. I paused. A few heads turned. Some nodded slightly. I could feel the tension in the room shift. I remember when Whispering Pines was nothing but trees and dreams. When we held hands to bless the first house. When we celebrated finishing the dock with a fish fry and a bonfire. That was the spirit we built this place on: community, trust, peace. I looked directly at Karen. She avoided my gaze, eyes glued to her notes like they were a lifeline. But lately, I continued, I've watched that spirit fade. What used to be about neighborly love has turned into neighborhood surveillance. What used to be about freedom has turned into fines. I was almost arrested yesterday for parking at my own home. Not because I broke any laws, but because someone didn't recognize me. And instead of asking, she called the police. That should never happen in a place like this. The room went quiet. Karen's leg bounced under the table. Greg cleared his throat, but said nothing. I went on. This HOA was formed to help manage practical things: trash pickup, snow clearing, keeping the community organized. But it was never meant to dictate every detail of how we lived. It was never supposed to replace kindness with control. Somewhere along the line, the rules became more important than the people. And that's not what I built. That's not what I poured years of my life into. That's not the Whispering Pines I envisioned. One woman in the back, I think her name was Eleanor, she'd been one of the first buyers, spoke up. He's right. We've lost something. I remember when neighbors helped each other here. Now everyone's afraid of getting written up. A few others murmured agreement. Greg sat up straighter, trying to reclaim the room. We understand your concern, Mr. Matthews, but the HOA is only enforcing what's been voted on. These rules were put in place by majority vote. I smiled. Politely, with all due respect, Greg, votes don't always reflect values, especially when they're driven by fear and not understanding. I'm not here to tear the system down. I'm here to remind you what it was built on. I'm here to ask that we review some of these regulations. Ease up. Remember who we are. Remember that this place was made for peace, not pettiness. There was a pause, silence so thick you could feel it in your chest. And then, slowly, someone clapped, then another, and another. Soon the room filled with applause, not loud, not dramatic, but steady, real. Greg looked overwhelmed, flipping through his notes, trying to redirect the conversation. We can consider a review of some policies at the next meeting, he mumbled, but the point had been made. After the meeting, several neighbors approached me, shook my hand, thanked me, told me they were tired of feeling like they were living under surveillance in a place that was supposed to be their escape. Karen slipped out quietly through the back door, not saying a word. I didn't chase her down. She'd heard me. That was enough. That night, I walked back to my cabin with a strange mixture of relief and sadness in my chest. Relief that my words had reached people. Sadness that it had to come to this in the first place. I stood on my porch and watched the stars, just like I used to as a kid. I thought about my grandfather, about how proud he would have been. Not just because I built a neighborhood, but because I fought to protect what it stood for. I knew this wasn't the end of the fight, but it was the beginning of something better. A reminder that even when rules forget their roots, there's still power in one voice, especially when that voice built the ground they're trying to control. In the weeks that followed the meeting, something in the air shifted. It wasn't dramatic, not all at once, but it was there. Subtle changes. People who used to nod stiffly now stopped to talk. A couple who never made eye contact before asked me if I wanted to join them for a bonfire by the lake. Kids rode their bikes a little more freely. The tension that had hung like fog over the community seemed to be slowly lifting. I wasn't naive. I knew that not everyone liked what I said. I knew some on the HOA board were probably still whispering behind closed doors, clinging to their power, hoping I'd just retreat quietly back into my cabin and stay out of the way. But the truth is, once you've spoken up once, you've reminded people where something started. You can't just disappear. You carry a responsibility. Not to lead, necessarily, but to stand guard over the spirit of what you built. One afternoon, about 3 weeks after that meeting, I got a knock at my cabin door. I wasn't expecting anyone. I opened it slowly, and there she was, Karen. No sunglasses, no dog, no clipboard, just her. She stood there for a long moment, clearly wrestling with what she was about to say. I didn't speak, I just waited. I came to apologize, she said, eyes low. I was wrong about you. I didn't know who you were. I didn't bother to ask. And I judged you. Her voice was quieter than I'd ever heard it. I was just trying to keep things in order, but I think I forgot that rules should serve people, not the other way around. I nodded slowly, surprised but not unkind. Thank you for saying that. It takes courage to admit when we've gone too far. She looked up and gave a faint smile. Do you think we could maybe work together? I mean, I've been thinking about the HOA. Maybe we do need to change some things. That was the first time I'd seen her as more than just an enforcer. I saw her as someone who maybe just needed a reminder too. A reminder that communities aren't built on control, they're built on understanding. We started small. We held an open discussion night at the community center. No agenda, no votes, just neighbors talking. Stories were shared. Concerns were aired. A man named Carl, who had lived in one of the back cabins since day one, talked about how he stopped planting flowers outside his porch because he was once fined for using the wrong size pots. A single mom named Tasha said she felt constantly watched and avoided going for evening walks with her daughter because she didn't want to break some invisible rule. These weren't petty complaints. These were signs that the community had started living in fear of each other, and hearing them out loud changed everything. A few weeks later, the board agreed to roll back several of the more aggressive HOA rules. They removed the parking restrictions that had sparked the original confrontation. They softened the language in warning notices. They even voted to create a new position community, historian, someone whose job was to keep the story of Whispering Pines alive. They offered it to me, and I accepted, not because I needed the title, but because I wanted to make sure the next generation didn't forget how this place came to be. I started giving walking tours on the weekends. Not formal ones, just casual strolls with coffee in hand, pointing out where the first trail was cut, where the old fire ring used to be, which trees had been there since before my grandfather's time. People started bringing their kids, asking questions, listening, learning, and something beautiful happened. They started taking ownership, not of rules, but of history. They started caring, not just about what was allowed, but about what mattered. About legacy, about land, about each other. The day I saw two teenagers helping an elderly couple carry groceries up the hill without being asked, I knew we'd turned a corner. Not because of fines or HOA mandates, but because the culture was changing. Not from the top down, but from the inside out. That's the thing about community. It isn't something you can build with rules alone. You build it with stories, with effort, with shared purpose. I looked around one evening, standing at the edge of the dock as the sun melted into the lake, and for the first time in a long while, I felt peace. The The kind of peace my grandfather must have felt all those years ago when he first stood on this very land. Whispering Pines wasn't perfect. No places, but it was healing, becoming what it was meant to be. And the cabin I built, my cabin, once again felt like home. Not just a structure made of logs and stone, but a place with meaning. A place that held memories, both good and bad, but always true. Sometimes, you don't know how much something matters until it's threatened. And sometimes, all it takes is one moment, one raised voice, one act of defiance, one unexpected police call to awaken something long asleep. I often think about that day when I pulled up in my truck and Karen yelled at me like I didn't belong. It was irritating, yes, frustrating. But in some strange way, I'm thankful for it. Because that moment led to all of this. It forced the truth to rise. It reminded people of where they live and why. And it reminded me that I still have a role to play here. That my job wasn't done when the last cabin was built. My job was to protect the soul of this place. Even when others forget. Especially then. So now, when I walk those same gravel roads, people wave, they smile, they stop to chat. And no one ever questions where I park. They know, because I built this neighborhood. But more than that, because I helped rebuild what mattered most. And if you've ever felt pushed aside, if someone ever told you that you don't belong somewhere you helped create, let this be a reminder. Sometimes, the people who try to silence you don't realize they're standing on the foundation you laid. You just have to stand tall, speak truth, and let your legacy speak louder than their rules.